Welcome, Wanderer. Have you ever been writing a story and then were suddenly petrified with fear because you realized you were writing for the opposite gender and you realized you don't know what it's like to be in the head of that opposite gender? Yeah, I've been there and it's a little awkward, but the good news is I can help you with that, and there are ways to make this a little easier on yourself to write for the opposite gender and to not freak out about it. So today's writing advice topic is how to write a character who is the opposite gender from yourself. People say that you should write what you know, but sometimes that's not always an option. There are going to be characters you have to write who are too far outside your scope of experience to say you know what it's like to be them. The most common is the opposite gender, which is what I'll be focusing on today. But there are some other examples too, such as someone who's just experienced different things in life than you have, and you have no idea what it's like to be in their shoes. Stuff like that. While I'm talking specifically about gender here, some of these principles will still apply even outside of this scope. Now, some people avoid writing these characters who are outside of their scope because they fear misrepresenting them or falling into stereotypes, something like that. But instead of being afraid of writing these characters and avoiding them entirely, we should just educate ourselves on how to write them more accurately. Also, it's more fun to branch out and try different characters that you're not as familiar with. So I'm going to talk about some of the common issues and fears you might run into while writing a character of the opposite gender, how to address those issues, and I'm going to give you a tool to better equip you to write those characters, starting at character creation. Now, I realize that gender issues can be a controversial subject, so I would ask that you please take note of this. I realize that gender issues and gender identity are serious topics that affect a lot of real-life people. Please note that much of what I'll be talking about will seem like an oversimplification of a very complex subject. That's because I'm only here to teach you how to write, not how to live your life. These tools are only meant to be applied to your fictional characters to improve their believability, and not to be applied to real-life people who are far too complex to be summarized in such a way. To that end, please don't assume my personal or political views based on this. I will strive to be respectful and sensitive to this point, and I ask that any commenters do the same. All opinions and voices are welcome here, but do note that this is not a platform for political or social debate, but a platform to learn how to tell better stories. If what you have to say serves to expound and edify for the purposes of writing, you are encouraged to share. Otherwise, please air your grievances on a different platform. Thank you for understanding. Now, let's get to it. So in order to avoid writing these characters, quote-unquote, wrong, we also need to figure out what it looks like to write them correctly. What is the goal here? So basically, the goal is when you write your characters, you should write them in such a way that no one looks at your writing and can immediately tell what your gender as the writer is. It should stand on its own legs, so they shouldn't be able to tell anything about you, because it's not about you, it's about your character. Personally, my favorite stories are the ones I read, and I'm surprised to learn, at the end, that it was written by a man because of how well the female character is portrayed. And I say that as a woman. So unless gender relations or gender identity are a big part of the character or the plot of your story, a character's gender should kind of just fade into the background if they're well written. You shouldn't really take note of the fact that they're male or female. That said, gender is just one more tool for characterization of your characters and can inform background, personality, how they view their world, how the world views them. It's a powerful tool, but it's not the only one. If it suits your writing style better, you can actually ignore gender roles entirely and focus on other elements of characterization instead. That's completely valid. But if you're worried about how readers will view your characters in relation to their gender role, this is advice for you. So why is it hard to write for the opposite gender? I've narrowed it down to 3 common problems. Number 1, feeling like you have no common ground with them. Number 2, the fear of stereotypes and falling into tropes, which I think is probably the most common issue. And number 3, maybe you're just overthinking it. Now, the fact that you clicked on this video tells me that you're probably in the third group, but hey, maybe we can still learn something together. After all, what are writers if not chronic overthinkers? So let's address the first issue, finding common ground. It's easier to write a variety of perspectives if you can relate to them. And what's the easiest way to relate to someone? Find someone to relate to. Basically, make friends of the opposite gender and talk to them about their experiences. Note the similarities and differences to your own life and experiences. And realize that you're probably not as different as you think you are. What also helps is to consume stories told from this alternate perspective. Read a book or play a game that's written from the perspective of this opposite gender that you're trying to write for. Does it seem like it's a well-told story? Does the character seem well-rounded? Then it's probably a good example to work from. And of course, there's always the tried and true phone a friend. Ask for advice from your resident expert. So if you're a man, ask any woman. If you're a woman, ask any man. If you're wondering if your writing is accurate, have them read it, and then listen to their feedback about whether or not you're doing a good job writing for the opposite gender. Now, the most important part here is that you're actually listening to them. You're only going to learn if you're putting in the effort to learn and are open to critique. The second issue is fear of stereotypes. This is a valid concern because it's pretty easy to fall into these if you're not conscious of what you're doing, and they can be pretty harmful if they're handled poorly. So what can help with this? Knowing the stereotypes that you're most likely to fall into is a big part of it. So here are some of the more common stereotypes that you'll find for male and female characters. For our male characters, we have number 1, the meathead. This is the man with no brain, all brawn, and he's just about to beat everything up because he just can't handle his own feelings. Number 2 is Prince Charming, who is basically just made as eye candy. He's there to be there for the female character, usually the female lead. And he doesn't really have a personality of his own. He might be kind of standoffish or mysterious, but he doesn't really have any qualities beyond that. He's kind of just there for the female character. And then the third one is the heartless. He has no emotions. He's just there to have angst and cause problems, and he doesn't feel anything when he hurts people or when people he cares about get hurt. Not accurate to how people actually are in real life, so I can understand why this is upsetting to read if you are a man. And then our more common female stereotypes include the femme fatale, the female version of the eye candy character. She has no personality beyond being an icon for male gaze, and she's just kind of there to be sexy. Second one is the boss babe. Personally, this is my least favorite stereotype of the female characters, because they are so prevalent today. But basically, the boss babe just does everything perfectly the first time she tries, and she's just there to, kick ass and take names. But she shows no emotions, she has no heart, and she doesn't care about the people around her because she's just there to look cool. And she tends to be the main character. And then our final one is the damsel in distress, who is significantly less common, but I think we all know who she is. She's the kind of the Snow White character who falls over at the sight of any kind of danger and has no spine and just kind of is there to be saved by another person. Now, personally, I've noticed that a lot of people will fall into the boss babe when they're trying to avoid the damsel in distress. That is not the ideal solution to this problem, but we're going to talk about how to avoid these stereotypes better. Now, I mention these stereotypes because we've probably seen them in all kinds of literature or media, and the assumption is that when you hear the word stereotype that it's automatically a bad thing, that it's wrong. But the thing is, you can actually handle these stereotypes pretty well if you do it right. They can be helpful if they're used correctly. One of the best ways to use them is to subvert reader expectations. So let's say you have the meathead character, but then suddenly he has a big brain moment and he does something really clever. That's a good moment in the story, right? Because it draws your attention to this character and makes you realize that there's more to them than you initially thought. That's a really good writing device. So I wouldn't say to throw out the entire stereotype notion just because you're afraid of falling into them, but just to be aware of what you're doing when you use them. Personally, I believe that all of these stereotypes are pretty easy to avoid as long as you're being conscious about your writing and you ask the right questions. And the fact that you're on this video tells me that you are asking the right questions. So you're probably not going to fall into these stereotypes like you think you are, but it's good that you're thinking about it. Really, all you have to do is work on making your characters three-dimensional, and these stereotypes aren't going to be a problem. And if you're stressing a lot over whether a character is a stereotype or not, they're probably not, but phone a friend if you're not sure. Which leads us into the third and final problem, overthinking it. Sometimes you just need to start writing, and you need to stop worrying about whether or not you're writing this character accurately, and just trust that your brain knows what it's doing when you're writing these characters. Because ultimately, the differences between men and women are not as extreme as you might think, and you'll find that in many ways you can actually write them exactly the same way, and you don't even have to keep gender in mind per se. So if you just focus on making a character that makes sense, the gender role should fall into place naturally. But if you're still nervous about it, here's a tool I sometimes use to help make well-rounded characters that read accurately within the gender roles I assign them. There are two elements to a character's gender role, the gender they are and the gender they are perceived as. These usually align, but they don't always. As the writer, your concern should be that they are perceived by the reader the way you intend them to be perceived. So for example, if you write a male character and you want them to be read as masculine but kind-hearted, if he reads as feminine instead, you have a problem. If you have a female character that you want to read as feminine but fiery and strong-willed, and she reads as a flat boss babe stereotype, you have a problem. If you have a male character that you want to read as more feminine but still strong and capable, and he reads as a pathetic pushover, you have a problem. So I find it helps to stop thinking about, is this character male or female, but rather, how do I want them to be perceived by the reader? If you look at cultures around the world and throughout history, you'll see particular gender roles that people are expected to abide by. Similarly, certain personality traits, interests, and desires align with these cultural gender roles. I'll be referring to these as masculine and feminine traits. Masculine and feminine traits are much deeper than how someone dresses or whether or not they can birth babies, though that plays a part technically. It extends to personality traits as well, and this is what I typically focus on for this process. As a general rule of thumb for you, masculine traits tend to be more protective in nature, while feminine traits tend to be more nurturing in nature. This is going to help you a lot when you start to use this tool. So depending on your story, I recommend examining what the gender roles are that would apply to the world that you're writing in. They may be the same as our world, or they may be different, but know that reader perception is influenced more by the reader's cultural gender roles and not your story's gender roles. If you don't establish your story's gender roles off the bat as being different from your audience's, they will assume that it's the same as their own. But you can use these cultural gender roles to create a character that reads exactly as masculine or feminine as you want them to be read, whether they align or conform to these gender roles or not. So I use this mental tool I call the gender scales to determine how my characters are reading. Every character has traits that are traditionally considered masculine or feminine, and characters, like people in real life, have both masculine and feminine traits regardless of their gender. So remember, protective equals masculine, nurturing equals feminine, just as a general rule of thumb. So to determine if a character trait is traditionally more masculine or feminine, just look at how their trait is portrayed in the media. Which characters are more likely to have this trait, men or women? If it's predominantly men, it's probably a masculine trait. If it's equally split, it's a neutral trait, and won't affect how your character's gender is perceived. Having more masculine or feminine traits will determine which gender your character is perceived as by your reader, like weights on a scale. If a character is reading too masculine for your taste, add more feminine traits. If a character is reading too feminine, add more masculine traits. Continue the balancing act until you're satisfied with where that particular character falls on the scale. Note that the solution isn't to stack one side of the scale and leave the other side empty, as you're more likely to fall into stereotypes that way. It's not realistic to only have all masculine or all feminine traits, so to make a well-rounded character, I recommend at least one trait on the other side of the scale. You'll find that some traits weigh more on the scale than others. Is this a prominent aspect of this character, or just a little background trait that rarely comes up? You might need to add another prominent trait to the other side of the scale to keep the balance the way you want, or collect several smaller traits to counterbalance. I recommend only adding traits, not removing them. Each trait adds more depth, so it's better to have more if you can remember to include them in the character. As a bit of a case study, this is one of my character's gender scales that I used. This is Lucian. It's actually because of Lucian that I thought up the gender scale. Some of you know that he started as a thought experiment, a gender-bent self-insert, just to see what he'd turn out like. I ended up getting attached and he grew a life of his own, but he shares many of the same personality traits that I have. But to get him to read as more masculine than myself, I had to play around with the scale and give him more masculine traits than I had, and further emphasize the masculine traits that I already had. But I didn't remove any feminine traits, though I minimized some, as it was important to me to retain the initial spirit of the character. As a result, his scale leans more masculine, and I've never had someone tell me that he reads as particularly effeminate. The feminine traits only serve to make him more realistic and interesting to read. You might be surprised by some of the traits I list as feminine or masculine, but remember that this is simply aligning the traits with traditional cultural gender roles, and doesn't necessarily mean that the opposite gender doesn't often have these traits in real life. You may list some traits differently if you try this exercise, and that's fine, as long as it makes sense to you. And that's about all I had for you today on writing for the opposite gender. I hope it was helpful, and I hope you learned something, and if not, then, well, I'm sorry. I hope I'll do better next time. Do you struggle to write for the opposite gender? What do you do to avoid writing stereotypes? Let me know in the comments, and if you found this at all helpful, go ahead and leave a like and follow and for more art and writing advice. If you have a suggestion for a future video topic, go ahead and leave a comment and I might address it. Thanks for stopping by, Wanderer. Now go write some awesome characters.